Hello one and all, welcome to the War Zone. I'm Scruffy, and this is Scruffy Tales. And we're doing something different here. We are gonna take a look at the terrifying power of Sweden's gå på tactics from the Great Northern War and how that helped the Swedish Empire crush close to all opposition that dared to stand in the way of the Swedish army. And I think if you've clicked this video, you are well aware of the tactics of gå på from the Great Northern War of the Swedish Army, the Caroleans as they were known, who put emphasis on close quarter battle. They were experts with the bayonet, with the rapier, and with pike, and they didn't want to engage the enemy at range. They wanted to move up to the enemy as fast as possible, fire the muskets at basically point blank range, and then charge in with the bayonet. And this allowed the Caroleans to defeat enemies that outnumbered them 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 5 to 1. They just defeated incredible odds at every turn during the Great Northern War. And the tactics of gå på, which basically translates to move on, march on, or walk on, basically, was central for this the effectiveness of the Carolean army. So they became famous for marching through enemy fire at range and they would march through cannon fire, musket fire, for hundreds of yards until they were roughly at 50 meters, 50 yards, thereabouts from the enemy. There they would stop, open fire with their first volley. They had already taken 2-3 volleys from the enemy, plus cannon fire. So at 50 meters, stop and open fire for the first time. As you can imagine, they are now pretty much very accurate. Almost every musket will hit the target. Then they would march on with the troops in the rear ranks who had not yet fired. They would move up and take the front position and move closer to the enemy, while those troops that had fired fixed bayonets, drew rapiers and readied pikes and what have you. And then the second line or the third and fourth line rather, that have now stepped up, they continued marching along the enemy, stopped at around 20 meters, 20 yards, and fired the final volley. And at that distance, that close, every musket will hit the target. And this is, of course, when the smoke clears, the Swedish army charged into close combat with the enemy and engaged them with bayonets, with rapiers, and with pikes, and crushed all opposition. You famously had the Battle of Narva, where the Swedes were outnumbered, was it 4 or 5 to 1? They attacked Russian defensive positions, charged through the snow, a snowstorm, blizzard, straight into Russian lines, and crushed the Russians and forced them to withdraw at Narva. You have the Battle of Fraustadt, where you have a Saxon-Russian army that outnumbers the Swede 2 to 1, and the Swedes charge into the enemy without firing a single shot. They run through the enemy fire straight into close combat with the bayonets and manage to outflank the enemy with their cavalry and completely eradicate the enemy army in that battle. It was a massacre. And the Swedes didn't fire a single shot. They charged straight into close combat. And at the Battle of Malatitze, the Russians surprised the Swedes on the right flank, launched a early morning attack against the Swedish right flank, the Swedish camp on the right flank, with the elite Russian guard, outnumbering the Swedes many times over, tried to push them out of the encampment, and the Swedes counterattacked with gå på tactics. Specifically, the Skaraborg regiment came to rescue, ran up, opened fire at point blank range, and then charged in with the bayonets. And outnumbered by the elite Russian Guard regiments, the Swedish line infantry forced them to fall back, forced them to retreat, and then the Swedes cut them down en masse in some swamps and marshes nearby, where the Russians got stuck in the wetlands and were easy targets for the Swedes. And I mean, this was not a one-off event. In basically every battle that they took part in, the Caroleans, relying on go-på tactics, crushed the enemy. And there is a lot of focus on the Caroleans' effectiveness in close combat with the bayonet, rapier, and pike. That is what you usually think about when you talk about the Caroleans, how they would charge into close combat and destroy enemies that outnumbered them many times over, and won the engagement in brutal hand-to-hand combat relying on shock tactics. But we're going to take a look at what happens before that charge and just how devastating the Swedish musket fire must have been at 50 and especially at 20 meters. And to understand how devastating the Swedish volley, musket volley was at the time, we're gonna take some help from a video I saw made by Ballistic High Speed, How Powerful Are Black Powder Guns? And it's a 23-ish minute long video. I'm gonna borrow 20 seconds of it. I hope they don't mind. And I'm going to show you the link. Click that link. It's going to be provided down below, because I'm going to show you 20 seconds and the video is 23 minutes. So check out that video. It's awesome. And by the way, take a look. He's carrying a Carl Gustav recoilless rifle on his shoulder. And I don't care what they call it in your country. This is a Swedish GRG and nothing else. I don't care if you call it a Charlie G or Carl Gustav or whatever. It doesn't matter. It is a GRG. I will give the Norwegians a pass, because their name for it is RFK, and that translates to recoil-free cannon. And I'm okay with that name. That is a badass name. RFK, recoil-free cannon. The Norwegians get a pass. So you can call it GRG or RFK, but nothing else. Okay, but anyway, so I'm gonna borrow a snippet from this video, and I hope they don't mind. So let's take a look at the devastating power of a musket when fired at close range. Right, so remember, 20 yards, shooting muskets, boom. How many of those muskets will hit the enemy in the face? Take a look at the damage done. Take a look. Boom. At 20 meters, 20 yards, every musket will hit its mark. And how many would hit the enemy straight in the face? I mean, the Swedes march through incoming fire until they are at a distance at 50 meters, where they know their first volley will be effective and they will hit their mark. Then they push up to 20 yards, 20 meters distance from the enemy, and fire that final volley. How many bullets, or musket balls rather, will connect with the heads of the enemy at that distance? I mean, standing in the enemy army or in the opposing army of the Swedes, imagine when they launch that volley. You're already dealing with the casualties from the first volley. Now they're firing again, and they are hitting with every musket, and people's heads all around you begin to pop wide open. Heads are torn clean off the shoulders. Others get shot multiple times in their chests, in the stomach, in the torso, in the arms, muscles ripped clean from the arms and what have you. And like I said, heads popping like melons all over the place. People are screaming out of terror, out of pain from the wounds. You have officers screaming and shouting, trying to get the lines back in order. It is chaos. It is horror. It is hell. There's brain splatter all over. You got pieces of skull stuck to your uniform. And then you hear the loud war cry of the enemy army as they charge in through the gunpowder with bayonets. And there you are, your lines are in shambles. So many of you don't have a head left. And the enemy charge in to finish the job with cold steel. So no wonder then that the Caroleans, the Swedish army, could just crush the opposition. If they marched up so close that their musket fire would be so devastating, so powerful, so effective, and then they charged into close combat, the thing that they had trained for the most, the use of the bayonet, the use of the rapier, supported by pikemen. So they charged into this sludge of human flesh and bone where people were crawling around, wounded, screaming in pain and fear. People shocked. I mean, PTSD, I mean, Jesus Christ. Brain splatter all over, blood covering them, the blood of their friends covering their uniforms. And here comes the crazy Swedes, the Caroleans, running in and begin to stab people left and right with bayonets, with rapiers and pikes. I mean, no wonder that enemy armies would just run away, would break apart and run for their lives. I mean, we talk about how excellent the Caroleans were in close combat with the bayonet, with the rapier, but the true secret to their victories must have been that final volley at close range that would completely and utterly disrupt the enemy lines. And then they would just run in and kill at will these shell-shocked, maimed, and torn apart troops that had no chance of defending themselves. And the enemy line would fall apart, break apart, and the enemy army would rout. So yeah, I mean, when you talk about the Caroleans, there's always emphasis on how excellent they were in close combat, how, I mean, elite they were in the use of the bayonets, the rapier, the getting support from the pikes and what have you, and all of that. But I think the true secret to Gopal was, of course, that final volley at 20 meters that would just wreak havoc on the enemy lines, and then the Caroleans charge into the chaos, into melee, and just starts stabbing people, trying to make sense of the carnage. I mean, there's blood and guts and split apart heads all over the place, and here comes thousands of crazy Scandinavians with sharp sticks poking at you until you die from it. I mean, so yeah, I think that final volley really deserves a bit more praise when you talk about the Caroleans. And I, after seeing the video made by Ballistic High Speed there and how a musket ball can pop a head wide open, I just immediately thought of the Caroleans and realized just how devastating, how brutal, horrific, and what a nightmare the tactics of Gopal were when you were on the receiving end. I mean, it would just wreak havoc and tear people apart, literally tear people apart. And then the Caroleans ran in as you were trying to make sense of the chaos, and they would just begin to stab people to death. So no wonder that armies broke and ran away. I mean, it must have been a nightmare. It must have been a complete nightmare going up against these tactics uh, that were so effective, so brutal, and the Swedish soldiers had no issues at all to run up to you and stab you as many times as needed. Yes, crazy stuff. Anyway, that's gonna have to be it. I hope I'll see you in the next one. And with that said, bayonet på, gå på marsch, framåt.